Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah? We're about to get started, so if there's anyone outside who would like to come in, please do so. And we will start in a few seconds. And maybe there's lots of empty seats up here at the front. We're going to... So I really encourage you to come over this way. Please come over this way so we're feeling very lonely over on this side. Move, sit, please. There we go, thank you. Because we're going to have a lot of back and forth with the audience, I hope. That's the plan. Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us. My name's Nigel Sizer. I'm the Chief Program Officer with Rainforest Alliance, based in New York. Thank you to the Global Landscapes Forum, the German government, and our hosts here for organizing this wonderful event and giving us the opportunity to be with you all. And I'm so impressed to see so many people here at 6 p.m. on a Saturday night for a 1.5-hour conversation about supply chains and landscapes. My wife thinks we're absolutely crazy, but we know otherwise. So thank you for being here, and thank you for the panelists who will be coming to and introducing shortly. We have a great panel here tonight. Basically, we have 3 objectives to this panel on supply chains, people, and landscapes. First, discovering the roles of governments, companies, communities, certification standards, and jurisdictional approaches in shaping a scalable and market-driven approach to support sustainable landscapes. Secondly, exploring how agriculture and forest product supply chains can be incentivized and better employed to help sustain and restore those landscapes. And thirdly, learning about different tools that are working at the intersection of landscapes and supply chains to achieve landscape scale results. And this panel actually builds on a wonderful session that we did in Nairobi at the Africa Global Landscapes Forum, where we had colleagues and partners and farmers actually from West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa talking about their experience and contributions to landscape restoration. We have a great panel, and we have all of you, and we will be having a lot of discussion with you. So there'll be some short segments of back and forth I will do with the panelists, and then I'll be turning to you several points through this and towards the end. So please be ready to ask provocative, challenging questions, make comments and contributions, and share with us, because I know there are many people in this room who know as much or more about what we're talking about than we do. And I believe it's very, very important that we show progress on these topics and on a much larger scale. As we all know, there are enormous commitments that have been made. The AFR 100 now has 112 million hectares committed by 25 countries across Africa to restoration. It was only about 90 million hectares when we were meeting in Nairobi just a few months ago. The 20 by 20 initiative in Latin America has over 30 million hectares committed by governments. And then there are countless corporate and other commitments as well that have been made to restore landscapes, to address poverty, to work on improved commodity prices, to work with smallholders, and so on. But of course, we all know that the progress in implementing these commitments is highly variable. And there's a real risk that the commitments get way ahead of the real action and change that we are seeing on the ground. So this brings us to markets and the potential power and role of markets in helping accelerate this process. And we do see significant progress, I think, by markets, by companies, some of them linked with the certification programs that we at Rainforest Alliance work with, others with the partners of IDH. Dan from IDH will be talking more about that. who are making real progress. We see a big shift, for example, towards shade-grown coffee and shade-grown cocoa rewarded by supply chains. This is farmers planting trees on farms, restoring areas around those farms. We see some fantastic stories and examples of this, and also on the social side as well. The potential is for far more of this. If we can drive more incentives down through the supply chains to the millions of smallholders who own and control and make the decisions about what happens across millions, hundreds of millions of hectares of landscapes, then we can make much faster progress on this. And at the same time, help address the entrenched poverty that is still at the end of many of those supply chains. So that's how I see the context for this session. So now we'll turn to the panel, and we're going to start with Mexico and Guatemala, and we're going to switch over to the Skype, if our technical colleagues could do that at the back. This is the only segment where we'll be connecting on Skype. So this first segment of the panel is going to be looking at the experience in Mexico and Guatemala with community-led forest management linking to global supply chains. And the first speakers I'm coming to, there they are Gladys Garcia, who is an indigenous community leader from Mexico. Hi, Gladys. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
And Erica Rodriguez, who is with Rainforest Alliance, part of our Mexico team, who's also going to help with translation for Gladys. Gladys and Erica would have been here, but they're at the COP in Poland, talking about this work and obviously its relevance to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So welcome and thank you for joining us. And if you could like to take a couple of minutes to just introduce yourselves, and then the first question I have for you is could you talk about your successful efforts and how you have succeeded in Mexico in working with communities on conservation and on improved livelihoods? Go ahead.
Sure. So I'm going to introduce myself in English, and then we're going to switch to Spanish, because I'm going to be doing the translation here for Gladys. As you said, Nigel, I recently joined Rainforest Alliance in Mexico as the capacity building specialist for a project called the Dedicated Grant Mechanism for Indigenous People and Local Communities, which is a project held worldwide in 10 different countries so far, Mexico being one of them. The main objective of this project is to strengthen the capacities of indigenous people and local communities that depend on forests to participate in REDD mechanisms at a local, national, and international level. So that takes us from Mexico to Poland this time. We are currently attending the third global meeting for the DGM, the Dedicated Grant Mechanism, which is an event hosted as in preparation for the COP here in Poland. And we have been talking a lot about the local communities and indigenous people platform, which will be, and its operationalization, that's a hard word, and also about the role of indigenous people in the Paris Agreement rulebook that will be negotiated during these couple of weeks. So I'm gonna let Gladys specifically talk right now. She's gonna be most of the talking. So we're gonna turn off the microphone now and then so I can make the translations for her. And if there is any need to make an additional participation, then I will be intervening, but she will do most of the talking. So for the first question, I'm just going to translate. Si quieres.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Gladys García Osorio, soy de México, del estado de Oaxaca, la región norte, de la zona de la Chinantla, y pertenezco al comité directivo del MDE México, y en esta ocasión estamos participando en la reunión previa para la COP. Y en respuesta a la pregunta que nos hacían de los esfuerzos o trabajos que hemos realizado en favor de la conservación con los medios de vida, han sido muchos, dado que la conservación nos ha permitido a nosotros como indígenas a seguir trabajando en nuestros cultivos sin dañar la cobertura forestal. La conservación no puede ir de lado con la creación de nuevas medios de vida, puesto de que de ahí somos, y no puede ser muy desapartado de la realidad, ¿no? Nosotros compartíamos un poquito la experiencia en la que teníamos antes, de que si destruíamos la conservación o los bosques o nuestros recursos naturales, pues quienes dejamos de existir, pues somos nosotros, ¿no? Entonces, antes teníamos el problema de la destrucción del mismo felino que se comía a nuestros animales de traspatio. Entonces nosotros mismos nos dimos cuenta que nosotros mismos éramos los culpables de que el felino se acercara a nuestros hogares, puesto que nosotros nos habíamos acabado su cadena alimenticia de ellos en el bosque, y lo que adoptamos nosotros como un acuerdo regional, dijimos que el agua, ni los animales, ni las plantas, ni nadie conoce sus límites. Entonces lo que podíamos hacer es delimitar un poquito nuestras áreas, nuestras zonas agrícolas, la zona de conservación, e ir rotando un poquito los sistemas productivos de las comunidades, haciendo el buen manejo del café bajo sombra, implementando la apicultura en los bosques para fortalecer un poquito más en esto de las plagas que habían acabado con cierta parte de los bosques, y hemos fortalecido poco a poco estos trabajos, que no han sido fáciles porque hemos tenido que adoptar prácticas o técnicas que nos han enseñado con lo que nosotros conocíamos de nuestros ancestros. Entonces, creo que el estado de Oaxaca es el mejor ejemplo del buen manejo de sus bosques, adoptando ciertas medidas para seguir conservando de la mejor forma sus bosques y haciéndolo sustentable, ¿no? Y teniendo recursos económicos al obtener productos del bosque. En el caso de turismo, bueno, nosotros no le llamamos turismo, es
Gladys,
ecoturismo.
I wonder if maybe Erica, would you like to just translate first, because I think there's some people in the room who are wondering what's being said. So if we keep going in Spanish, if you could translate that first part, and then maybe I can ask a follow-up question.
Okay, just that we thought that you had simultaneous translation.
No, we don't. You're the simultaneous translation.
Okay.
Sorry. But I think you know. I think you know. Go ahead,
Okay.
or just summarize in English. I mean, I think half of us probably speak Spanish, but half don't.
That's perfect. We're going to be going a bit slower then, so Gladys can stop from now and then, and I can try and translate for you guys.
If you can just translate that piece, and then I'm going to ask another question,
Sure.
because we need to keep moving here.
Okay,
Go ahead.
perfect. So Gladys is talking right now about her experience and the experience in her community by the work and also that they have done. It's very important to say that she lives in one of the most biodiverse regions in Mexico and probably in the world, which is the Oaxacan Sierra Nantla. She belongs to a community over there, and she's representing an organization which gathers around 6 communities in the Sierra of Oaxaca, or the Oaxacan Highlands. And she was just talking about their experience with shadow growth and everything they have done with this.
They have also many different projects with the production of honey, and she's basically recognizing the importance of conserving their forests for their livelihoods. No, the first thing that she said is that if the forests are not conserved, they are basically ending with their own existence, and that is the way they see this. Oaxaca is known in Mexico for their voluntary protected areas, which is a protection scheme that we have in Mexico so that communities and privately owned lands can be declared as protected. And in Oaxaca is a great example of this. Many of their protected areas are actually voluntary. And she was also talking about, she was about to start talking about the experience in ecotourism, which has been also a great, which represents a great income for them, specifically scientific tourism, considering the biodiversity that they have over there.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask a different question you weren't expecting, so sorry about this. Today's a big day.
Okay.
Today's a really big day in Mexico because you're inaugurating a new president who is quite different politically from what you have had there recently. Just take a minute or two to talk about your perspective on that, and you know, what would be your message for President Manuel Obrador as he comes into power about what the government should be doing and how the government should be working with communities across Mexico, and what could result from that. Just give us a quick response to that. And then I'm going to move on to Jose Roman here on the stage with us.
Me sorprende un poquito decir esto. Sin embargo, considero que era necesario un cambio en nuestro país. Ha hablado el pueblo, lo ha elegido el pueblo. Sin embargo, todavía estamos con una gran incertidumbre en el manejo forestal comunitario. ¿Cómo va a trabajar con las comunidades? Ahora, okay, so I will be translating as we go. So first of all, she's pretty amazed of this question and surprised. She says that in Mexico, we needed this change. This president was elected for a great majority. It was actually a historical result that we got from these elections. And we are actually all wondering what is going to be the strategy of this new president to work with the community.
El nuevo presidente se fijara un poquito más a las comunidades indígenas, porque los territorios están en manos de comunidades indígenas sin violentar sus derechos agrarios, empoderándolos de una manera que sea eficiente, ¿no? Adoptando medidas para que sean ellas las que tomen decisiones si sí quieren adoptar ciertas medidas en sus territorios o no quieren hacerlo. Todas las herramientas necesarias para que nuestras comunidades puedan entender realmente la importancia que tenemos nosotros al decir nuestro sentir.
Okay, so she says that attention must be given to the communities, especially considering the Mexican context. The context Mexico is actually owned by local communities, which are called usually ejidos or comunidades. She considers that this is a great opportunity for letting communities manage their own territories without affecting the rights, the property of the land, and that they should be given the tools to make out these livelihoods that we were talking about.
Thank you very much. The connection was breaking up a little bit, so I'm going to, if you would stay on the line, and we're going to turn off the video, but if you could continue to listen, we might have some questions for you later. And I'm going to turn to Jose Roman Carrera. If you'd like to just introduce yourself, Jose Roman, and talk a little bit about your experience working with community-based forest management in the Petén and the impacts you have seen and the key role that supply chains for forest products have played in that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Hello, everybody. My name is Jose Carrera. I am from Guatemala. I have been working 28 years with sustainable forest management, focus in community forest management and small and medium enterprises. The last 18 years, I have been working with Rainforest Alliance. My current position is Director of Partnership and Development for Latin America. I am a forestry engineer and I hold a master's degree in biodiversity conservation. Today, I will speak about a community sustainable forest model in the Mayan Biosphere Reserve in the north of Guatemala. The Mayan Biosphere Reserve is a landscape of 2.1 million hectares, including a core zone, buffer zone, and multiple use zone. And the communities are managing 350,000 hectares under FSC certification with best management practices. 20 years ago, the government grants to the communities a concession, and the government gives the rights to the communities to manage timber and non-timber forest products. Rainforest Alliance has been working over 20 years providing technical assistance to the communities and in coordination with other local and international organizations. And the main impact achieved today are the following. In the area where the communities are working, the area that they are managing, the deforestation rate is almost zero, compared with 1% in the core zone and 5% in the buffer zone. So the communities are doing an amazing job preventing the deforestation and the forest fire in that area. In this area, the communities are generating $7 million per year coming from timber and non-timber forest products. And they are benefiting more than 12,000 people with direct benefits and 70,000 people with indirect benefits. The health and education have improved. The generation who started the community forest model 20 years ago, they only 20% of those people have access to formal education. Today, 100% of the children and young people have access to formal education. Thank you to the incomes from the timber and non-timber value change. The immigration in that area is almost zero because the community members have employment during the whole year because the timber and non-timber value change. The salaries that they get are over 30% of the regular salary that should be paid by law. So the social income for those community members are really, really great.
Thank you, Jose Roman. I'm going to turn it to the audience now before we go on to our next panelist. So I want to open it up for you, for any comments or questions or reflections on what you're hearing from the long-standing and very significant work in Mexico and Guatemala, which we have certainly learned a lot from and are building on and taking to other parts of the world. But who would? Olga? Yes, please. Great. And Fabian will run rapidly with a microphone. That wasn't so rapid. He can do better.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Olga. I also work for Rainforest Alliance, and I'm rather new in the organization. That's why I'm also learning. And my question is to you, Jose Roman. Over these years, what have you learned that's not working in this model and cannot be replicated? Because I think what you presented is so practical and concrete, and at the same time I'm hearing so many complicated concepts, resilience, and I can assure you, if we had more private people, private sector people here in the room today, they would probably walk out because it's so complicated. So what have you learned from simple things that have really made this change happen? Thank you.
From the beginning, when the concession model was set up, in the concession contract, there were three main actors. The government, who owned the land, monitor the concession, the environmental, social, and economic achievements, the communities who implement the contract through the sustainable forest management, and the NGOs who in the contract says that has to provide technical assistance. And in the concession contract, it was a very, very important element that the concession contract said that all the concession that was granted should be FSC certified after 3 years of being granted. So the government required that all the communities should be certified. So when it started, it was a very complex thing, because you know how certification works. Every time that a team of auditors go to the forest or to a farm, they give a lot of precondition, or things that should be improved. And when the certification started, there wasn't a really certified market for those products. But since the process works, the markets go up, and now all the buyers who buy timber and non-timber products in that area require certified products. And one good example is when in 2008, when it was an economic crisis globally, in different countries, the timber and non-timber products didn't have really market. The markets went down. But in that area, the market didn't went down. And why? Because the buyer preferred certified market. So certification had played a very important role. The arrangement between government, communities, and NGO is really a public-private partnership, and this really helped the model work and provide good impacts. There is one thing that needs a lot of work to be solved, and it is the governability in the area. That area are facing some narco-traffic problem close to the community concession, and it needs more presence of the government in the area, so the community concession can have the condition to improve and diversify the model.
Thank you, Jose Roman. Does anyone have a question or comment for Gladys and Erica while they're on the line? Let me just see. Yes, for Gladys and Erica? Yeah, in Mexico? From Mexico? Go ahead. Gladys and Erica, if you're still there, this is for you.
Hey, my name is Robin, and I found it very interesting, the insights you shared from the process in Mexico. And you were saying that that it was really important for you to support the people living in or by the forest to become aware or realize that they are also part of the problem, or that they are culpable. And how did you support them in their process?
Thank you very much. Gladys and Erica, can you hear us?
Yes, we can, but we missed the second part of the question.
We'll repeat it.
How did you support like the people and the indigenous that you're living and working with in realizing their own impact and role or negative impact on the forest that they had.
Okay.
Go ahead. Gladys and Erica, go ahead. Yeah, you're translating. Good.
Yeah, I was just translating, yes.
Thank you. Go ahead.
¿Cómo hacen las comunidades cómo hacemos para sensibilizar a las comunidades de los impactos negativos que pueden tener en sus bosques?
Ya. Lo hacemos a través de videos de concientización de al no hacer el buen uso o el buen manejo de los bosques pueden repercutir en cierta medida. He dado ejemplos del cambio de clima que hay en las comunidades que nos están afectando terriblemente. Yo decía antes de que las comunidades que mejor conservan son las más castigadas con el cambio climático porque les cambia el calendario agrícola y hemos hecho a que además de nuestras comunidades que están conservando, invitamos a otras a ver todas nuestras experiencias para que ellos lo repliquen más adelante y con nosotros nos quedamos con ellos, de que ellos nos ayuden a que más gente se enteren de lo que estamos haciendo.
Okay, so she was saying that they are basically working a lot with education and many different mechanisms to get them know the value of their forest and how they can benefit from these. They also have many different initiatives to work with different integrating the efforts of different communities to manage their forests. I would like to add personally that in Mexico there are different mechanisms that also that communities are like taking advantage of, for conserving their ecosystems. And in the DGM we are also working with improving these livelihoods and improving their capacities to manage their forest and manage their resources sustainably to provide livelihoods for their community. So I think this is very important. We were talking with Gladys about accessing the RED mechanism, for example, and she says that it would be these financial mechanisms are very interesting, but she says she considers that it's not enough. That community should have the tools and the tools and the knowledge to improve the management they make on their own forests. This is a previous conversation that we had, which is I think very interesting to answer this question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'll come to Jose Roman to pick up on that one. In the work in Guatemala, there was a major effort also to generate carbon credits to directly benefit the communities on a large scale. And it had the potential to be really a leading effort in that sense as well. So an additional incentive for the communities and reward to them for their work in forest conservation. But it's run into some significant complications as well, as we know. Maybe you could just comment very briefly on that experience.
The forest communities have been working 12 years in the Guatecarbon project, we call. That is a reduction emission by avoiding deforestation and degradation project. The communities start when the technical tool was in place, so it took long time, but now the project is already developed and it is verified by the CCBA and BCS standard, the climate, community, and biodiversity standard, and the volunteer carbon standard. And from 2012 to 2014, it has been released 1.2 million verified units of carbon that are ready to go to the market. So the communities didn't receive the economic incentive because they didn't sell the verified unit, but the unit is already released. And the other good thing is that the government in Guatemala has been working in the deforestation strategy and in one red program with the World Bank, and the program has advanced, and we hope that the program will start working the next year, and the communities will be included and can sell their verified unit. So the community has advanced in one side, and the government has advanced in the other side, and we hope there is a point where they can get the benefits to improve sustainable.
But it's taking a lot longer than we had hoped for the community and the governments to come to an agreement on the benefit sharing from the sale of the carbon credits. And so this becomes quite a significant example of the potential for this to generate tens of millions of dollars for the communities, but the fact that this is held up due to institutional, political considerations that has prevented this from moving forward, although everything is basically ready to go. Thank you, Jose Roman. Thank you very much, Gladys and Erica, for joining us. If you'd like to stay on the line and listen in, please do so. If you need to get ready for your sessions in Poland, we understand, and you can leave us as we move on to other parts of the panel. So thank you, everyone. We'll now turn to Dan and IDH. And we do have another speaker for this section, Andreas Breeder from GIZ, who is not here. His train, somehow his German train did not make it on time, which I assume is the first time that's ever happened. But he's really apologetic, but he expects to literally be arriving right around now if he managed to catch another connection. So Andreas hopefully will run into the room here and join us. But if he doesn't, we're in very good hands with Dan Vensing, who is Program Director of Landscapes and Deforestation Commodities at IDH. Welcome, Dan. Thank you for joining us and for being a great partner with us in various things over many years. So Dan will introduce himself, and then he's going to talk about, how can we get long-term engagement and investment in jurisdictional approaches from various sources, including from the private sector.
Great.
Just talk about how you see us solving that challenge.
Great. Thank you, Nigel. Good evening, everyone. Well, as an introduction, I think my wife feels exactly the same about tonight as your wife does. So I'll just explain you why I sit on this stage Saturday evening. During my master's in conservation biology, I worked in the Bernardo O'Higgins National Park in Chile, which is in Patagonia. It's a national park about the size of my country, the Netherlands. And in that park, you will find actually one of the two animals that are on the coat of arms of Chile, the huemul. And while working there, we actually discovered the largest remaining population of the species in the world. At the same time, we then had to write a management plan for the entire park and to protect the species from going extinct. And then, well, we developed a plan together with the community that lived in the park. There's only one village in a park the size of my country. There are no roads, there's ice, there's mountains, what have you. So it actually didn't require a whole lot of finance to protect it because it's difficult to access. But still, in the end, the government told us, well, there's zero money. And then I thought, well, actually, that's a bit of the story of conservation and sustainable development at large. So I went back to Europe. I went to business school because that's where you learn how to make money, and then decided to merge the two. And you know, throughout my career in the private sector and later at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, I've always been trying to find this balance between, and actually the interface between economy, development, and conservation. So when 4 years ago, IDH, the Sustainable Trade Initiative, started working on landscapes next to its work on driving basically the sustainability agenda of individual supply chains like tea or coffee or palm oil, I joined. And over the last couple of years, we've developed an approach what we call produce, protect, and include, which is really about this whole balance between economic development, sustainable natural resource management, and how do we help smallholders, farmers, communities to benefit from that and to grow. This program now operates in 9 countries across the globe, from Latin America, across Africa, and also in Southeast Asia. And in all those countries, we've selected landscapes where actually global supply chains meet a certain jurisdiction, where there is deforestation happening or there is water depletion, what have you. And for us, the entry point for all of that is to support the development of a coalition between government, private sector, farmers, NGOs, knowledge institutions, to develop what we call a green growth plan. So a plan towards 2030 that balances the sustainable production, the protection, and the inclusion. And for us, that is also the entry point to bring in investment. Because at the moment, if you look at the private sector and they want to invest in these kind of areas, often it's risky because for the reputation, because there might be deforestation going on, or the size of a certain deal for an investor is just too small. And if you form such a coalition and you have such a plan with clear targets, roles, responsibilities, governance, monitoring attached to it, it creates an enabling environment for investment. It enables then the environment or the investment of the private sector, of investment funds, also of governments, both the own government but also donor governments. And that to us is really where you start. And you see now these kind of systems coming up all over the world. But we've also realized that if you really want to move it to the next level, then you have to translate it from the level where we normally develop these plans, a province or a state, to the level of a municipality or a district, as it's called in Indonesia. And there you basically then develop the targets for that particular jurisdiction. You bring all the layers of government in, national, if it is a national government, provincial, district level, so that all the different jurisdictions that meet on the ground are representative and are on board. You bring, again, local producers for the various commodities that are out there, so not just one. And you also include food crops, energy needs, etc., etc. You link those to the global supply chains. You link them to investors. You bring TA partners like NGOs, like knowledge institutions, and together you enable this investment.
Thank you very much, Dan. And one of the things that strikes me about this is it is quite complicated, and it's a lot of work to make this happen, right? You've got a whole team working on this, quite significant funding, and your work, you've made good progress in let's say a handful of places, and are trying to bring in a handful more. And yet we need to see this across literally thousands of jurisdictions, just in Indonesia, let alone many, many other countries. So talk about how you see this really scaling. And what I have in mind here is, obviously, if the private sector can really be the engine for this, then it can scale, because they are all over the place and have the resources. How do we get that to happen? How do we get the private sector to go beyond the narrow interests of and understandably narrow, of their supply chain to the wider landscape and jurisdiction, and really supporting and helping scale this work themselves, because they've got the capacity to do that if they want to. Yes.
Now, I think you also narrow down on the mandate that IDH has in terms of development in sustainable landscapes, which is indeed involving the private sector. Yeah. When we were basically asked by our back donors, European governments, to develop a landscape program, it was exactly that. Can you please bring investors? Can you please bring the private sector to the landscape agenda? And as you say, Nigel, that's not an easy task, and all of you will know that. And in the end, I think the solution is self-interest. That is the only real thing that drives it. If, for example, we work in the Mau forest in Kenya, and it's a forest that on one hand has tea estates of Unilever and Finlay's huge tea producers, smallholder tea producers, and on the other end of the forest, there are communities that live more from dairy production and other sorts of income. And the forest is basically being stripped away from that end because that's the only way that the economy can grow. So we formed a pact around that forest with the government, as I said, the various layers of government, with the tea industry on one hand, the communities surrounding the forest. And we now, and why do they form a pact? And why would these tea companies now invest all the way at the other end of the forest? Because that's what they're doing. It's nowhere near their concessions. It's nowhere near where they source. And it is that they've realized that that forest is determining the microclimate that the tea bushes need. And if that forest further deteriorates, the microclimate changes, and those concessions, which still have leases for over 80 years to come, are just, stranded assets. So that is one way to go about it. In Indonesia, to give another example, we work with a number of forestry companies, and they operate on peat. Now, they've also come to the realization, and also, of course, legislation is changing there, and the events in 2015, of course, also changed the way peat is being managed, that they can't just by themselves, manage their part of the peat dome. They really have to start working together. All the neighboring concessions are their competitors, so they never, ever met or spoke. And now they've identified a case, because if they manage the water together, it saves money, it prevents fires, etc., etc. And that was the only trigger to deliver this kind of change and to enable the investment.
That's great, thank you. Let's go to our audience here. Any questions or comments on the jurisdictional challenge and opportunity? It is Saturday evening, isn't it? I will start calling on some friends of mine in the audience. I'm looking at them if people don't speak up. Yes, please, go ahead, over here. And just introduce yourself if you could.
Thank you. I'm Parashina Lampert from Kenya. My question goes to the...
It's good.
Yeah, my question goes to the gentleman who spoke about trying to link economic viability to conservation. And I'm also happy that you've mentioned Kenya and the Mau specifically, because it's one ecosystem that it's really the heart of water resources and more livelihoods for the country as a whole, not only for the communities around. But my question is, I don't know whether you've worked with communities and conservation entities that are focusing on wildlife conservation, because the biggest challenge that we now have, even on the in wildlife management, is that it's becoming very difficult for wildlife conservation to pay for the communities. I mean, you ask communities to set aside parcels of land for wildlife conservation to be wildlife corridors, and to ensure that we connect these critical ecosystems and protected areas. But you don't provide them with a livelihood. So our challenge is always, how do we ensure that we provide them with a livelihood so as to give them the sense that they should conserve? And how are you working with civil society, for example, in the landscapes? Because you've mentioned of government and other entities. I don't know whether you have maybe an example of how you you've worked with civil society to ensure that we perpetuate the culture of conservation and also linking it to economic viability.
Thank you very much. Dan, would you like to start? Yep. And then Jose Roman maybe would like to comment on this as well. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. And indeed, it's the Mau is one of the key water towers of Kenya. So, of course, it benefits many more. And I think one of the ways that we try to work on the incentives, right, in terms of basically rewarding the protection end of the agenda, is if I talk about the other end of the forest, not the end where the tea estates are, but at the end where all the communities basically are situated. We help now with investment of our own funds and also from the private sector to increase the productivity of dairy and the other forms of income that exist. And by doing that, we hope to then create that incentive to not go to the forest. We also link those efforts directly to supply chain. So not that you just invest in productivity and then maybe people are stuck with more produce and nobody's buying it, right? So we link it really to the off-takers, not only the supply chain, but also the final off-taker. But they also build in then disincentives, right? That if they source from there and they invest in there, and as long as the forests remain standing, it's good to go. The moment the forests start deteriorating, then they enter into a dialogue. So that it's not only the incentive, but also a bit of a disincentive. And that is how we try to combine it in this example. Now, the point of the NGOs and the CSOs is, of course, very important. And also, in the MAU, we don't only work with them, like with NGOs like Rhino Arc, but also with the community forest management units or associations, the CFMAs. There are many out there, and we work directly with them in terms of supporting them in their activities of rehabilitation, of protection, of livelihood creation. So it's really also working at the grassroots level.
Thank you, Dan. Jose Roman, any reflections on that question?
Yes. In the case of the forest communities, they start working with the timber forest products, then the non-timber forest products were included, generating more economic incentive, then the environment services, such as the emission reduction by avoiding deforestation and degradation, and then the sustainable tourism is a new area who is coming in the same landscape from the community to generate more income. And the way how they have been appropriating is through creating local capacities at the community level and forming local professional teams to implement the best management practices. For example, when the model started, the development agencies pay for the technical capacities and the professional teams, and now the professional team are paid by the communities, and they lead those teams, so they get the appropriation through their own young and professional teams.
Thank you. Anyone else? I've got Lawrence. Yeah, go ahead, Lawrence.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Lawrence van Oeyen, also from the Rainforest Alliance. Dan, very impressive approach. I think it's, as you said, sustainable landscape approach is all about partnerships. You mentioned a couple of critical partners, private sector, CSOs, knowledge institutes, and governments, national governments. Now, I know that big private sector companies are not per se the biggest friend of national governments. I remember when I lived in Africa, there were private sector companies saying, as long as I do not meet the government, then I'm okay, then I'm going to be able to pursue what I really want to do. I think times have been changing, and indeed, more and more, if you want to go towards a sustainable landscape approach, I think private sector and national governments need to work together. In developing your approaches and facilitating the approaches, how critical is it that the government has an active role in this landscape approaches? Or is the approach also that you just say, as we heard in the previous session just now, because government changes every 3, 4, 5 years, it might be prudent to keep them informed, but don't depend on them.
Thanks, Lawrence. Great. Dan.
Yeah. Well, I think, on the introduction of, basically the discomfort between private sector and government, which is actually both ways. Wherever we start or we're being invited to support, this is the situation. So I think, as has been reflected today and many times before, landscape approach is not a quick approach, right? It takes time to build trust and confidence between those various stakeholders, that they actually sit at one table and then slowly start sharing what they need from each other and how they can help one another. In our approach, government is central. So in the green growth plans, those are normally led by a governor and his team. In the compacts at the jurisdictional level, so that's the local green growth plan, the local mayor or bupati or equivalent, they own it, they drive it. However, we also institutionalize it. So often there's a coalition, a governance form, which is then enshrined in law. So that even if someone in the government level is not re-elected or can't be elected and someone else comes in, the governance, the targets, they are then actually in law, so that they continue. And that is a way to work on this. And in the end, going back to your introduction on this discomfort between various stakeholders, I think wherever we work, the more they start engaging and working together, they can see that actually, all of them hold different pieces of the puzzle. And by really working together, they can look at, the bigger issues that go beyond a single crop or beyond a plantation. So still, it's not easy, but yeah, I believe we need to go that route.
Great. Jose Joaquin, you had your hand up over here. Yeah, and just introduce yourself as well. Thanks.
Yes. Jose Joaquin Campos. I am the board chair of the CIFOR and in the board as well of ICRAF. And this question is for Jose Roman Carrera, is regarding the community concessions in the Petén. Which strategies have the concessions developed to capture more value, economic value from the forest? And also, what role has partnerships played in helping those communities capture more economic value? Thank you.
Thank you, Jose Joaquin, for the question. Yeah, one of the main strategies is creating a second-level enterprises named Forestcom, who has three main roles. The first role is to add value to timber and non-timber forest products. The second role is to find market links with the new buyers. And the third role is to keep the certification running. Because they have a group certification, costs go down and the certification system can be consistent. So that was the main strategy that had been working, because now, when they started, they were only with 2 species, mahogany and cedar, and now they have been included around 12 species. So they, and beside that, they now are adding value. They are producing decking, flooring, furniture, so more products. So that can be a key strategy. And in terms of partnership, it has been a fundamental strategy, because now they have long partnership with some buyer. For example, in United States, they work with General Woodcraft. They have a partnership for about 15 years, and they have been evolving in new products. And General Woodcraft has been investing to develop the products. The same they do with Continental Floral Green, long partnership for more than 15 years, increasing the demand and organizing the supply, and Continental Floral Green invests in the communities too. And they have a very good partnership with churches. They are working with more than 5,000 churches in the United States, and churches pay an extra premium because they are providing certified products with social and environment responsibility. So those partnerships are giving extra value, social and environment value, because, for example, in the case of the churches, they require that funds goes to education and health, the premium price. So they are improving the human capital.
Thank you, Jose Roman. And just to clarify, if you're not familiar with the story in Guatemala, the link with the churches is because there are women-led cooperatives as part of the work in Petén who are organizing the collection of understory palm leaves, which are carefully prepared and then exported to the US for use in Sunday services, 5,000 churches, as Jose Roman says. And this has been a tremendous boost and income for the communities, and it's all led and run by the women. It's very, very inspiring. And complements and contrasts in very interesting ways with the timber economy, which is run and led by the men. And I'm not going to say which is working better, but one of them is. Yeah, the women do a better job. Let's, as usual. So let's move on to the third part of the panel here, which is on standards and innovation and where supply chains meet the landscapes in that world. We've got two great colleagues to help us with this. Joanna Durbin is going to kick off. Oh, actually, Lenneke Braam is going to kick off. We're going to start with Lenneke, who's Director of Standards and Assurance. She oversees the Standards and Assurance in the Rainforest Alliance certification and Old UDS program as well, currently working in parallel. So Lenneke, thanks for joining us. And the question I have for you after you've just introduced yourself a little bit is how do you see certification evolving or should be evolving to support wider landscape scale and jurisdictional interventions? An easy question.
Yeah, so hello, good afternoon everybody, and I just wave my hands to those that I've not seen yet. So indeed, my name is Lenneke Braam, and I'm so responsible for, as you said, Nigel, for the standard development and assurance. We're a pretty large team, and I was actually counting the number of nationalities in my team, and we're 14 different nationalities in my team. And I'm mentioning this because I find it I'm very proud of it, actually, because that means, you know, we want to get the flavors of how people live and how they work from across the globe into our organization and have a constructive conversation about, you know, how can we develop a standard that makes sense? So at the moment, we are about to finalize our first draft standard. It will be launched coming Monday. So I would say keep an eye on your inbox, because this will be the opportunity for you to react on the first draft, our first joint initiative resulting from the merger from Rainforest and UDS. And we are very excited about presenting you that new standard. And it is, and to make the bridge to that, to the question you raised, Nigel. So we developed a standard, and when we talk about certification, we talk mostly about product certification, because as soon as you go into the shop and you buy a product with a seal on it, you want to have the guarantee that what you're buying, what you're consuming, is coming from a responsible source. So, and that is also in line with what ISO rules say, you know, as soon as you put a seal on it and you claim that it's sustainable, you have to have product certification and a check on the ground on the conditions how the product has been produced and manufactured. So that's where we're coming from product certification, auditing at farm level and their processing activities. And at the same time, we also do realize that it does not stop there. From product certification, we need to move into an area where you also see the farm in its context. And that's also what we want to do with this new standard, that we reach out and that we make that connection between the farm and the landscape. And how do we do that? We do that by having, especially, and the standard is for smallholders. We have requirements for smallholders, and we have requirements for larger farms and estates. And one of the a few requirements we have on how to engage with communities. So we want to bring in the responsibility of a large banana plantation, for example. We want to bring in the responsibility of the banana plantation into the landscape. And part of the requirements is, for example, that engagement, that active engagement with the communities, especially when it's about land use and the impact it might have on their resources. So how is certification, product certification, evolving into a landscape area is by making that connection to the communities.
And as we do that, and as we look for sort of wider landscape scale benefits from this work, how do we make sure that this doesn't just add more complexity and more cost, particularly for the millions of smallholders that are at the end of these supply chains, many of whom are still very poor and struggling to even come into more basic systems.
Yes. So what is part of the new certification approach that we will have for the new Rainforest Alliance organization is that, you know, there are a lot of audits going on. And instead of having audits, you know, just your pass or fail, we want to make use of the audits by collecting relevant information, relevant data that is being fed back to the producers and supply chain actors and auditors as well, so that we can combine the information and use it to, for further analysis and for targeting better interventions. So instead of accumulating the cost, we want to turn the cost into, investments that are being used to make targeted interventions.
Thanks, Lineker. Let's turn now to Joanna Durbin. Joanna, would you like to introduce yourself? And then the question for you is, we'll talk about this initiative that we have together with you and several other partners called the Landscape Standard, and how you see that complementing sort of the farm by farm or forest by forest based supply chain certification programs.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to meet you all and talk here. In order to introduce myself, I asked to include this slide because I'm actually talking on behalf of a much broader initiative between a large number of NGOs. I work for the Climate Community and Biodiversity Alliance, which is already an alliance of many NGOs in itself, with Rainforest Alliance as a member, but also the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, Wildlife Conservation Society, and CARE. And then we're collaborating with FERA, who have a long experience in development of standards in the carbon space, but now working in sustainable development, impact standards, and others, and this landscape standard, obviously Rainforest Alliance. And with the other partners you see on the screen who are working as part of this alliance in piloting the standard in Ghana, in Costa Rica, in Peru, and in Guatemala. So to get back to the question, and I suppose the link with all the other interventions is, you know, we're seeing the importance of, and there's growing recognition, I would say, of the importance of addressing sustainability issues beyond just single farms or single investments, and the importance of bringing together actors, government, incredibly important, but with the producers and with the external actors that interface with them, you know, the commodity sourcing and companies and financial investors, and the civil society. So recognizing that you can't address deforestation or water issues at a single scale, but you need this collective action to address it. One way of facilitating that and providing some impetus to it is to provide credible information on what the results are of that collective action. So that's the aim of this standard. It's to provide credible, robust information about landscape sustainability outcomes, not how they've been achieved, but the results across dimensions, and that go beyond one single investment or one supply chain. So if we just look at the next slide, if you would, I want to show you this as this is a kind of simplified framework that we're working on. It's in development, you know, with the early stages of this, but it'll be ready for broader consultation very soon. And it's, you know, showing what we mean by going across dimensions. So environmental, social, economic. We're talking about production landscape. So production and governance. And trying to be simple, recognizing that you can't look at everything, but homing in on, and the interesting thing about this standard is, or this framework, this assessment framework, is it's creating the interface between what's happening in the landscape and the information that is provided to the people outside the landscape, so the commodity companies and others. I'm not going to go into the details, but the question was, what is the link with the site scale? Well, there are some things that you need to tackle at a broader scale, but there are other important elements of sustainability that need to be addressed and checked and verified at the site scale, at the farm scale. And a good example of this is free, prior, and informed consent, which we know needs to be, you need to respect the rights of indigenous people, local communities, and others. You can't check that on a landscape scale. You have to check it investment by investment or whatever. But there are also other issues that we've discussed, like yield and the adoption of sustainable practices, etc. It's very hard to address them at a broad scale, but so we see a complementarity between the information coming from sites and the need for information at a larger scale, a landscape scale, a jurisdictional scale.
Joanna, a follow-up, and I know it's early in the development of this, so we're really sort of looking out and visioning how this is going to help. But maybe you could just say a little bit about how do you imagine or hope a company might use the landscape standard? What kind of claim would they make? How would that work? And how would that be, and how, it's very different from what we have in our current certification program, I think.
So it's very important to understand that we're looking at the sustainability of a landscape, not of specific products. Yeah. Yes, so, and the reason for this is you may have many different sectors that affect sustainability issues in that landscape, and you may have many different actors. And so, it's a bit, and I think we're probably all moving towards, or what we need to move towards, is that a greater traceability and transparency, to the point that when you buy a product, you want to know how it's been produced, but also where it comes from, and what are the sustainability issues in that place that it comes from. So you're looking at, we all know when you buy wines, from France or whatever, you're looking for the appellation contrôlée. You're looking for the place that it comes from. That gives you some information about, well, let's not take the analogy so far, but the taste or whatever, I don't know. But you can imagine a time where, well, and I hope that I think we need to get there, where when products are being exchanged, there's the information about where they come from and the sustainability issues in that place. But we're not actually assessing exactly the same thing as the farm level certification.
So a company could, based on this, would be able to make some kind of a statement if they're saying this tea comes from this landscape, and here are some objective metrics about basically the state of this landscape and the progress that's being made to address these different dimensions.
How much deforestation has been reduced, or linking it with REDD+ or something, how much there has been a reduction in emissions, climate change, but looking at a basket of different issues. So some companies may be more focusing on the social issues, and they could be making claims on the social issues. But I suppose the innovation in standards is you're not just looking at certifying pass, fail, but you're verifying and validating and verifying the quality of the information that is being used for the decision making that can then, so hopefully, and that's the idea, is create incentives for improved performance as it gets further response from the external actors.
So a race to the top.
That's
is what
the
we
idea
hope to
with
see this
standards.
generating.
Yeah.
That's great.
Can I add to
Lenneke, go
that?
ahead. Yeah, please.
Because there is such a nice interaction also, because when we talk about good agricultural practices, that is very straightforward. When you do product certification, go into the field and you check, do they prune correctly and so forth. But there are quite some elements in good agricultural practices, like erosion control, or like keeping, when you do your spraying of pesticides, that you keep it a distance from a water source. So these are elements that through certification at site level, and if you do that well and you collect the information, it's hugely interesting to interchange that with information collection at the landscape level, because you're talking about water quality in the end. Yeah. So, or by soil enhancement techniques and so forth, and soil quality in the end at the larger landscape. So there are quite some interesting intersections where data collection can be very helpful to make that comparison.
And it can help companies, agencies, NGOs and others identify where they need to invest, where are the problems, where are the challenges, where do we need to engage more, and on which aspects, and how does that vary, and why does that vary from one landscape to another, what's going on here. Tony, please, and anyone else coming to the audience. I thought that might raise some questions.
Thanks very much indeed, Joanna, and thanks for the invitation, Nigel. And Nigel asked us to be provocative. So I'd like to apologize to everyone in the room in advance, because I can't quite read all of Nigel's handwriting.
I did not. But I don't have to answer the questions, they do, so be as provocative as you can.
So, Joanne, it's great. You've come down to 22 indicators, you know, compared to the 121 in SAN, brilliant. Still though, which ones of those do the National Bureaus of Statistics collect in countries? Which one of those are developing country governments championing? Because part of the problem with the original certification was that NGOs ran so far ahead of developing country governments that we don't really see developing country governments as the key champions and flag bearers of certification. Mm-hmm. Now, we all love standards, we love certification, we love the frog, we love Boots, we love everybody up there. But let's imagine the shoe was on the other foot. Let us imagine that for Ethiopia or Kenya in coffee, or Cote d'Ivoire for cocoa, they were in a position of control. And they could say to Europe, well, we know how much you Europeans love standards, and we know how much you like criteria for certification. So now we hope that you agree with all of these, okay, because these are the principles. Number one would be, there's a shortage of supply of cocoa in the world, so we're only going to supply to those countries that can certify to us the following. Number one is that our product is shipped between Africa and Europe in vessels that report their CO2 emissions, okay? Because we all think that's a great idea, you know, so Cote d'Ivoire should be insisting that we transport in vessels that report CO2. Great. We only want you to sell in countries that have no tariffs, no barriers to trade for agricultural products. Now, we also only want you to sell in countries that do not subsidize inorganic agriculture, because that's like $700 billion a year of distortion. You know, we don't want that. And then lastly, surely everybody in the room must agree with this one. We're going to sell you cocoa beans, but you must guarantee us that you do not sell a single chocolate bar to anyone who is racist. Because, oh, seriously, racism is a bad thing. We don't want to promote it. And yes, it sounds absurd, that perspective. But many developing country governments see this as absurd. They say, well, why is it the governments and the consumers and others, these should be good for our farmers, this should be good for our country. We should be the ones driving this process. And we go from absurdity of obviously those certification criteria, but I would ask you to look back through that lens on these. The second point would be proxy metrics. The human heart has 201 causal factors for coronary heart disease, 201. 3 of them, high blood pressure, smoking, and cholesterol, account for 75% of heart disease. So the health sector focuses just on 3. It's all of their public awareness, their interventions, their investments, their monitoring and reporting. 3. We've got 22 there, and some of them agree with. It's surprising not to see gender balance as part of human rights, but okay, you may have it under discrimination. But what would be the proxy 5 or 10 metrics that would explain 80% of what you're trying to achieve? Rather than taking the individual indicator to the criteria, to the principle, to the pillar, what would explain most of what you're trying to achieve around governance, productivity, profitability, environmental sustainability, and social inclusion? What if we looked at it from those 2 unusual angles, how would this table look differently?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. That's an easy one for a Saturday evening. Go ahead, Joanna. Hit that
great.
Out of the ballpark.
It's great, because it creates a good conversation. So the first thing I'll say is this is not finished. I'm showing this to you as a work in progress and an invitation, actually, to all of you, here to work together on this, because I think it's important. I've talked to a lot of people, and they say, "Oh yes, we do need this information about the results of landscape sustainability. Let's make it simpler." But is it? What do developing country governments think about this? Well, we're including them in this discussion. So, for example, in Ghana, the Cocoa Board is leading the local advisory committee that is leading the use of the landscape standard in the cocoa forest landscapes. So, and the same, in the other landscapes, a strong government involvement. So and we're in a phase now where we're developing something to be piloted. So there's a lot of back and forth. So what you see now is not what you're going to see in March next year or the following year. So we're putting something out there as a proposal and an invitation for further feedback and collaboration. We have a booth downstairs. I'll be there tomorrow. Not just me. There's a group of us, from Sophie from Rainforest Alliance and Dave from Vera will be there as well. So that's one. And yeah, I don't know if there's more to add. It's a work in progress. I think it's an important issue.
That's great.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it really is an open invitation. The way that these standards are developed is a very open process, whether it's this one or the new Rainforest Alliance standard, which goes public for a global consultation that will last for 3 months, and then it gets revised. And then there's another one of those that lasts for another 3 months. The RSPO on palm oil just went through this process. Liza, how many people and process commented on this? I mean, literally 11,000 comments fed in to the evolution of the RSPO standard. And they just announced quite an impressive evolution of their standard last week, which has had very positive coverage by those who are very concerned about the impacts of palm oil. But let's come to Tony's other point, other provocation, and maybe for Lenica, if the shoe's on the other foot, does that change your perspective on this, or is there, is there something fundamentally at fault with Tony's assumptions there?
If the shoe is on the other side,
you
need to explain to me what is exactly meant by that.
Tony's comment is that he asserts, and there are some assumptions in here, so I'll say this is his opinion, not fact. That's what we need to discuss. From the point of view of producing governments and people in the countries where we are doing a lot of work, this all looks absurd. Mm-hmm. How dare we, what right do we have to impose this standard upon them? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's why we don't impose. I mean, a standard is a choice. You want to comply with it or not. But if we talk about the involvement of the government in the drafting of the standard, yes, there is a huge number of consultation sessions being planned. They're actually taking place already across the globe, and in which we only raise the question, what do you think? What is the input you can give us? And also what is new in the new standard is that we want to make the standard more contextualized. All the time we talk about these standards. And yes, there is a number of core criteria that we say that's non-negotiable, everybody should comply with it. But there are also criteria which allow for more contextualized approach. And what we mean by that is, for example, the living wage discussions, which is an extremely important topic. A living wage in a plantation in Kenya is totally different from a living wage discussion in Central America when we talk about bananas. So there also in those discussions, we need the input from local people, local government, to develop a standard that makes sense in its context. So we say upfront already, this is how we think it might work, but we need to collaborate to make it useful and sensible.
Thanks, Annika. We're just past 7:30, but I do want to, there were some other hands that went up. So I'm actually going to quickly go around the audience. We've got 3. We'll take those 3 and see what we can do with that, and then we'll wrap up. And please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Gabriela Lopez from Guatemala. I'm studying Masters in Tropical Forestry at TU Dresden. And I have a question regarding certification being part of policy, especially in developing countries. And maybe Jose Ramon can explain a little bit more on like the key, what was key into making this concession program work, especially like the certification part, because this is very ambitious and this is actually policy and people are actually going for it, and it's also part of it being very successful. So what was key into making everyone come together and make this work? Maybe it can be implemented somewhere else, also in Guatemala, because it's very strong in the Mayan Biosphere Reserve, but also maybe it can be applied somewhere in other developing countries that still want to make this policy. And also taking advantage, a second question, because if you go still to the roads in Guatemala, you see a lot of cattle and a lot of palm oil. And how are you trying to convince or trying to promote more a shift into like timber and not timber products in this area?
Thank you very much. Let's take the microphone. You're making notes of these questions, yeah?
So thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I come from Vietnam, and currently I am a PhD student in Germany. I only have a comment regarding to certification, because I have worked in forest certification in Vietnam, and I know that currently forest certification standards is not that accessible for smallholder. For example, like currently about 250,000 forest certified in Vietnam, but only about 5% it belongs to smallholder. So the question is how to make forest certification more accessible for farmers rather than put more burden on them. And actually about 5% of these smallholder is under group certification, which is funded by different projects like WWF or FAO. So the question is how, when this project ends, how this group certification gonna be sustainable on themselves, rather than like maybe they're gonna have to be club or I don't know, how could they?
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And over here, yeah, wave. And just introduce yourself and your name as well.
Sure. Norma Pedrosa from Mexico. This is a question for Joanna. When you were talking about the landscape standard, it reminds me a lot to the Red Says standard. And I know that there are a lot of lessons learned from that standard, and I was wondering how you picked those lessons learned from this new standard that, as I saw from the draft that you say you're working on, it's still being the principles, the criteria, and the indicators. And at that time, at least for Mexico, that the pilot was held in Jalisco and in Peninsula Yucatan, it was very hard to work with a lot of criteria and principles that they were somehow Well, for example, there was this criteria of poverty, and it's very hard to make an indicators about poverty rate and the reduction of poverty in a landscape project or forestry project. When, yeah, I mean that means a lot of effort for achieving a standard. So how are you including all those lessons learned from REDCES?
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to do one last quick round across the whole panel. Try and be brief, answer the questions that were raised for you, and any other quick final comments, and then I'm going to wrap up because we're already a little bit over time. So Jose Roman, please.
Yes, thank you, Gabriela, for your question. I will tell you how in Guatemala the certification became into the government policies. When the government of Guatemala created the Mayan Biosphere Reserve in 1990, the multiple use zone of the Mayan Biosphere Reserve that had about 800,000 hectares was dedicated to timber and non-timber forest management and other low-impact activities such as sustainable tourism and research. And when the government started to promoting the concession, there was a very big group of people, stakeholders, that didn't believe in the sustainable forest management. And I had the opportunity to work with the government during that time, and we received a lot of complaints from international NGOs and from national NGOs saying, if you give the rights to the communities, they will kill the forests and the Mayan Biosphere Reserve will die. And we have some letter that NGOs sent to the National Council of Protected Areas. So we start thinking how we can solve this situation. And during that time, the FSSC was start building it, but when they start with a lot of good image. So that the government of Guatemala say, we will contact FSSC through Rainforest Alliance. We met a person there that was Richard Donovan. We brought him to Guatemala. He explained how the standard worked, and the government used the FSC certification as the solution, so the international NGO and the local NGO accept the sustainable forest management in the Mayan Biosphere Reserve. And it is how it became a policy, and it worked very, very well, because not only help to set the best management practices, but also help the forest community to achieve market links. And that was the good things in Guatemala. Related with cattle and oil pine, there are the two drivers of deforestation in Guatemala. They are responsible for more than 50% of the deforestation of the country. And that we have been doing is making alliance with the National Institute of Forests. So the pro-bosques incentives, the forest incentive for reforestation and restoration can help to restore degraded areas. That is one strategy that we have been implementing. The other one is working with the cattle producer and helping them to work with climate smart cattle practices, so they incorporate value-added trees in their cattle ranch, so they can make a balance between the emission and the carbon sinks with the plantation. And beside that, if you see the Guatecarbon project, this project covers 704,000 hectares, and it includes a lot of degraded areas around the concession. And if the economic incentive arrive, So those areas will be restored.
Thank you, Jose Roman. Dan, last comments.
Yeah, thank you. Well, building on Tony's point on, having this dialogue, but then in the reverse. So we were heavily involved in the shaping of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, which is an initiative between producing governments of cocoa, the entire cocoa sector, and from the outset, it was designed such that there was dual accountability. So it was not just, for example, the private sector telling, okay, this, and this needs to happen because otherwise we might not source or blah, 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 blah. And it was also not just the government saying, okay, but this is just how it's going to be and you take it or leave it. It was a huge negotiation. But now we have come to an agreement between, say, the producer government and the industry on terms of roles, responsibilities, who's going to do what, and we can monitor from each and every one who needs to chip in. And I think that then changes the equation, right? So it's no longer something on top of or something pushed. No, it is really taking that together. And I think that is also the step if you think about smallholders, right? What we talked about right now. I think if you look at the level of a jurisdiction and you really want to reach all the smallholders, then you need to come up indeed with a verification system that verifies all of them and not, say, the front runners. You need to create incentives for all of them. And I think there, again, there is a very strong role for government to play because they will look after all of the farmers and not just the few front runners. So I think, when we talk about, verification at landscape level, I think that is an element to bake in.
Thanks very much, Dan. That's great. Joanna.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. There was a very specific question on what had we, CCBA, learned from the RED social environmental standards, RED says. You talked about the experience in Mexico. And I think one thing we learned was, reduce the number of indicators, like you said. The other thing that's very different about this initiative is we're only focusing on outcomes and impact. We're trying to remove all the process indicators. So there were a lot of process indicators in there on how free, prior, and informed consent had been obtained and, lots of detail. But so this is trying to be much simpler. It's not down to the 3 yet, but let's see how much simpler we can make it, but still be meaningful and inform decision-making about landscape sustainability. And before I finish, I would like to thank the German government for the contribution to, or their support for the development of the landscape standard.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. And I can't resist adding to that from Tony's provocation. One of my favorite quotes is from Albert Einstein, who said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I think when we're looking at a landscape, it unfortunately may be a bit more complex than a heart. And I noted when you raised the question, instead of taking something off the list, you immediately pointed out something that was missing on gender. So please help us to try to make this more practical. Thank you. And Lenneke, last comment.
So I wanted to respond to the question on Vietnam, how to include the smallholders, and indeed, Dan, there's a role for the government also to play. But my answer would be twofold. First of all, from how we see the responsibility of the initiative, of taking initiative to set a standard, is that we put the requirements at such a level that it's feasible for farmers to join and that they feel encouraged to move up the ladder and then work on continuous improvement. That's one thing. And another thing is how to get the smallholders involved is by reaching further than only the farm certification and using the information that we collect to enter into a dialogue with the sector, with the government, and say, how can we expand? How can we expand and make certification inclusive? So that is also how I tie product certification at the farm level, how I want to tie that together into the landscape approaches.
Thanks, Lenneke. So we need to wrap up. Thank you all for being here. I'll just make a few sort of final comments and touch on a few of the key points that came up. Just take a second on that. We started off with Mexico and Guatemala, and we heard about the central importance of community rights and land rights for smallholders and local communities, indigenous peoples, and so on, and the amazing things that can happen when that is well done, and additional support and incentives are provided to those communities to manage resources across landscapes, while there's still tremendous opportunities that are not being realized due to enormous inefficiencies in the carbon markets and the development of institutions around those, for example, let alone the opportunity to transmit additional incentives down those supply chains with the help of the private sector. We heard about the political changes in Mexico, and of course, reminding us that as these inflection points appear in the political landscape, these are enormous opportunities for us and for our partners in some of these countries. So Mexico may be one place to be particularly paying attention to on this, and I'm sure you can think of some others that may be going through similar changes over the coming months. The importance of long-term partnerships and market linkages to drive and support this work. We heard about that from Jose Roman and from Dan, from IDH's experience. And the complementarity between the landscape scale approaches and the longer-standing more narrow supply chain efforts linked with certification, other voluntary standards, and other efforts by the private sector. It takes a lot of time to move this forward. It's been 20 years in Guatemala. You've been working very hard with IDH in the Mau Forest for several years. There's still a lot to do in these places. And so we need investments and support that are commensurate with those kinds of timeframes to move this forward. This is all evolving very rapidly as well. A lot of what we've talked about here is fairly new, including a major evolution and reimagining of the approach to certification that we are now leading following our merger with Woods, that Lenneke gave a few hints about, but there's going to be a lot more coming on that soon. And we are really open and really encourage you to join us in this effort. Many of you are already involved, and I know IDH, Joanna and her team and others, really encourage you to get involved and join us in this effort. It's only by working together, by creating larger and better alliances, that we're going to make progress on these wonderful challenges. So we're here. Please get in touch with us. Let us know how you'd like to join in. And with that, I want to thank you all for being here. I'm not sure what we have outside, but there's some kind of mingle. I hope there's some drinks or something. I don't know. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.